to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO. I want to also welcome World Oregon members and community. World Oregon is participating with us on today's program as a partner. We have a terrific lineup of in-person and live stream events for you in November and December, so please stay tuned for a quick update at the end of today's program. Also, we've kicked off our annual giving campaign to raise money to cover our operating costs. So please donate today so that you can continue to enjoy these timely and important nonpartisan programming that help connect you with the world, help us promote global understanding and civic engagement, which is more important than ever in today's very polarized environment. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce today's very special program, the Geo-Strategic Implications of the Uprising in Iran. With Goli Ameri, she is the co-founder and CEO of Start It Up, Marjan Greenblatt, who is founder and director of the Alliance for Rights for All Minorities, and Dr. Sharon Nazarian, president of YNS Family Foundation. Dr. Nazarian will be monitoring our program today. We welcome these wonderful women who are going to take us to the streets and tell this very important story. With that, Dr. Nazarian, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you, Kim, so much. And thank you to the LA World Affairs Council for having us with you today, and more importantly, bringing attention to this very, what we consider timely, important topic that needs to be kept in the forefront of all of our minds in order to bring some justice to the people of Iran. Today, you have three panelists who have been activists and scholars and researchers on this topic for a number of years. So I'll start with offering some framing remarks, and then we'll have 2 rounds of questions from myself and all my colleagues, Marjan and Goli. So we hope to bring some more nuance and some analysis to what we are seeing on our news cycles for the past 40 days. So really, starting with the 1979 Islamic Republic of Iran was established after the revolution, and there really are 3 ideological pillars that have kept this regime in place for the past 40-some years. First and foremost, a real vehement opposition to the US. You've heard and you've seen throughout the years, death to the US, and that is a very important pillar of the identity of this regime, kind of this animosity and aggression towards the US. And there are many reasons for that. I won't get into it, but that's a very important pillar. Second pillar is really kind of a very strident and vehement antagonism toward Israel. And that's been a very important pillar, both in terms of establishing the regime's credentials in the Muslim world. A lot of that had also showed itself manifested through pro-Palestinian positions. But as we've seen now in the last decade or so, real direct geostrategic and security threats towards the state of Israel. That's a very important ideological pillar for this regime. And then finally, where we are today is an institutional policy of misogyny, especially in the form of compulsory hijab, rules that require women to wear coverings in public spaces. So today, we are seeing a reaction to the killing of a Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, who was literally arrested because her hijab, her covering, was not put on properly. Her clothes were deemed to be too clingy, and therefore she was arrested and she was killed, what has now actually been verified, killed while in custody. So if any of these 3 pillars really weaken, the regime is in trouble. And today what we're seeing is the weakening of that 3rd pillar, this control over the life of women, how they manifest, how they show up in society. And that is a very, very important part of the credibility of this regime and its vying for survival. Now, traditional advocacy issues around this regime since 1979 have been myriad. You know, all 3 of us have advocated against this regime on many points. And I'll just point to a couple of them. So you'll see that this regime has been controversial on so many different fronts. And today we're seeing obviously the final front that I just mentioned, which is about control over women and their bodies. But what we've heard mostly about, I would say, in the last decade has been Iran's ambitions for gaining nuclear capacity and nuclear capabilities. The West, US, including as well as Russia, China, and the European Union have been really trying to contain Iran's ambitions for gaining nuclear capabilities through the JCPOA, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. You've all heard about that. There's been so many negotiations. There was finally a deal. And then with President Trump coming into the White House, removing the US as part of that deal. And now, since the Biden administration, a lot of attention has been given to the US re-entering and rejoining the JCPOA. So that's one area of advocacy has taken a lot of oxygen, a lot of energy, and still, I would say, with very mixed results. The second area of advocacy has been around human rights. And this regime is very much recognized and known as being an egregious violator of the rights of its own citizens. And Marjan and I both have worked on this issue under the auspices of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. So we have spent years advocating in European parliaments, in the halls of Congress, for legislators to understand that this regime daily violates the rights of its own citizens, especially its minorities, whether it's ethnic, religious, LGBT community, journalists, and women. So this has been the issue of human rights has been front and center for this regime and for the world for as long as this regime has existed. And all three of us have also been very active in bringing the plight of citizens of Iran, especially the minorities of Iran, when it comes to human rights issues. Iran's terrorism has also been a huge issue that has manifested in actual acts of terrorism against US interest, Israeli interest, and Jewish communities, especially in Latin America. And through its proxies, the regime, through support for Hezbollah, other militias in Syria, and elsewhere, the regime has really tried to kind of wield its own power through the acts of terrorism in the Middle East and across the world, in Europe and in Latin America as well. And then final area of advocacy, which really, again, myself and Marjan have spent a lot of time on, is the fact that this regime is the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism. Of any government in the world, there is no government today that proclaims more anti-Semitic and Holocaust denial rhetoric to the world today. This regime literally holds international cartoon competitions that show that essentially push a narrative of Holocaust denial. And so this has been an issue that many have focused on and many have advocated, in fact, for example, getting Ayatollah Khamenei kicked off Twitter and other mechanisms of trying to stifle the anti-Semitic nature of this regime. But what brings us today together really has to do with the gender apartheid policies of this regime. And so I want to turn to my co-panelists today and perhaps start with Marjan, who will kind of lay out for us what is going on right now domestically in Iran, on the streets of Iran, and where things stand as we speak. So Marjan, please take it away and kind of set the scene for us in terms of after 40 days, where are we today?
Thank you, Sharon, for this opening. And I want to also thank Kim for giving us this opportunity to speak to the wonderful audience of World Affairs Council. And if, with your permission, I also would like to give a shout out to Dan Schnur, who made this introduction to and helped us facilitate this presentation today. So thank you all for joining us and for paying attention to what is happening in the streets of Iran. So as you may have heard, the protests in Iran have, which was initially sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, have concluded they're entering their 8th week. for the past 2 months, the Iranian people who have been enraged by the injustices of the regime are taken to the streets to show their dissatisfaction with not only the death of Mahsa Amini in the most brutal and inhumane way, but also ask for their own rights. Because what sparked the death of Mahsa, what sparked the society with the death of Mahsa was that all people realized that they're all vulnerable. The different segments of the society recognized that they could have been Mahsa, that their sisters and their mothers or their daughters could have been Mahsas. And this vulnerability brought people to the streets to the point that they wanted to say, we've had enough, and this is it. But what also has been demonstrated in the streets of Iran with the continuation of the protests is that, yes, it was the unfair treatment of Mahsa, and it was about the desire of the regime to push the hijab laws on the society. But it is a lot more than that. They are protesting not just the hijab, but all of the unfair rules and regulations that affect their lives. And yes, the rights of women is significant because women and minorities constitutionally are second-class citizens in Iran. And they are saying no to that. They are rejecting this constitution that treats women as half of a man, minorities as half of their other citizens. And they are uniting with each other to say no to the Islamic Republic. Communities that were once upon a time fragmented through Iranian regime's divide and conquer policies of separating the religious minorities, the ethnic minorities, calling them separatists or Zionists or conspirators and so forth. They're all coming together in a message of unity in order to come together and support one another. One of the chants in the streets is, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, we're all together. And the communities that were once regarding themselves as potential enemies because they were encouraged by the Iranian regime to see each other as such, today they are saying from Zahedan to Kurdistan, I will sacrifice myself for Iran. As Zahedan ta Kurdistan janam fadai Iran. And they are saying these because they want to show the regime that they are united and they cannot be divided anymore. And with all of these activities and all this rage, even though they are being confronted with violent crackdown in the streets, and the regime is responding with more and more violence, they're just putting themselves in a cycle of rage that is bringing even more people to the streets. As you probably know, the 40th day of after someone passes away is a special day for the Muslim society to commemorate the death of the lost person. And now, burial after burial, 40th after 40th, for nearly 300 people, nearly 300 people who have been murdered since the murder of Mahsa Amini. Only more and more people are taken to the streets, and this has taken a snowball effect. And with this, all of the pillars that Sharon referred to, not just the hijab pillar, they're all falling apart. The pillar of anti-Iran, anti-Israel and anti-US propaganda, they have all fallen apart because they're knowing that the condition that they're in, that the challenges they are facing today is not because of Israel or because of the US. They are chanting that our enemy lies right here. Dushman ma haminjast. They lie when they say it's America. And so this pillar of anti-Israel enmity and anti-US enmity is falling apart. They're also realizing that the suffering and the circumstances that are being experienced in Iran is not a result of sanctions or poor economy. Rather, it is the result of a corrupt kleptocracy that has abused and used the financial resources of the country and blamed it on others. So there is no JCPOA, no sanction policy that can remove and erase the corruption that has been ruling the Iranian society for the past 43 years. And finally, the Iranian people, but across generations, across religious groups, across economic levels of prosperity, are coming to this realization, and they are rejecting the Islamic Republic, not just the hijab laws, not just the isolated dissatisfactions, but the entirety of this. And with that, I would argue that the Iranian society has reached a tipping point. It's a tipping point because the people are saying to the regime that they don't believe that this government is reliable and legitimate anymore. Whenever there is a new death in the custody of the police and the regime tries to whitewash it by blaming it on pre-existing conditions or suicide, the Iranian people are wiser and they're rejecting all of these lies and they are not believing any of these explanations. Whenever the regime tries to exert more fear and control on the society, they're actually responding with more bravery and more defiance and rejecting, again, the fundamentality of these practices, and they're saying no. And finally, there is also a tipping point, or we're at least approaching the tipping point, because unlike the past protests, today the international community is paying attention to what is happening in Iran. And they are beginning to respond in ways that they have not responded before. And that is something that the Iranian regime cannot change, because while they can control some aspects of what is happening inside the country, they are not able to change the realities as they're seen by the international community. And I know, Sharon, you have done extensive research on that as well.
Thank you, Marjan, for setting the scene for us. I want to just ask you one more point for you to touch on before I kind of do a little review of the world and what the government around the world have been reacting to. Marjan, that is the difference between this and past uprisings has been that the people of Iran thought maybe reform was a possibility. Will you just touch on that and how this time it's just that's not an option for this regime?
Yes, so then it was when the protests first captured the international attention in 2009, after the rigged elections that put Mahmoud Ahmadinejad into power instead of the so-called reformist candidate that the Iranian people were really fighting for, Mehdi Mousavi. There was this hope that, well, maybe after Ahmadinejad leaves and we have another round of elections and a real reform candidate, maybe things will be different. Simultaneously in 2009, while people were calling for the support of President Obama and the U.S. government, there was no response. There was no love and empathy communicated from the Obama administration, something that recently President Obama, just in the past few weeks, expressed regret about. But in 2009, they did not get reform and they did not get international support. Then in 2017, when there were another series of protests that sparked in the December, the day protest, as they were referred to. Again, this was during the Rouhani administration, when the society thought, and it was also post-sanctions removal. So the people thought that, yes, that we should not be suffering in the way that we are suffering with a reform movement in place and with the JCPOA in place. So they were really hoping that there would be a different circumstance, but that did not happen either. And then we heard about the November of 2000, the 1919 protests, followed by the scattered protests during COVID. And with all of these demonstrations, there was a reality that we have tested the reform movement. It did not work. We have been in JCPOA, and that has not improved our lives. And we don't have any more solutions at our disposal except for reliance on our own abilities and our own voices and our own desire to take to the streets and seeing some change. You know, I will end with this. Martin Luther King said that protest is the language of the unheard. And it is something that is done because there are all the other avenues for advocacy and for seeking change are no longer available. And that is why they're there week after week.
Thanks, Marjan. So obviously the international community can play a decisive role in really helping the protesters take the steps that they need to take in order to take their country to where they wish for it to be, whether it's a democracy or whatever form that takes. I'll start with the US and maybe go around the world, kind of talking a little bit about the reaction of various governments to these uprisings. As we already mentioned, the US government, especially now in the Biden administration, started out by very focused on JCPOA. The administration wanted to see see the US back in the deal and strengthening the deal in whatever way possible. That reality has now changed, and we are very thankful for that. That kind of myopic view that nothing else mattered, and I can tell you, Marjan and I advocating specifically with members of Congress, Goli has done that as well, to bring pressure, to increase sanctions, just would fall on deaf ears in the previous years. But now we see real change where the US has come to the realization that not only JCPOA getting back into it is not a reality, but that it needs to change its narrative and really support the people of Iran in the way that Marjan mentioned the Obama administration did not. The European Union also was very focused on JCPOA for a long time. And human rights was just not a priority. And we have to remember that European countries are also very important economic partners of Iran. So there was also that financial and economic interest that was leading a lot of European policy toward this regime. Today, we see a change in that, and a lot of it probably pushed by this new layer of complexity, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, of Iran selling drones to the Russian government, drones that are now, as we speak, are being used to kill civilians in Ukraine. So this really brought the Iran issue to the forefront for the European countries and for the European Union, and made it an issue they could no longer ignore. So we're seeing now, for example, the former Swedish foreign minister saying that the majority of European countries around the world are now ready to accept Iran without the Islamic Republic. That's a very important statement coming from a former European foreign minister. And that in general, the regime has tried, and there's evidence of letters that were sent by the regime to various European governments threatening them and saying that if you move ahead with sanctions or more pressure on the Iranian regime, that the regime will cut off economic ties, and it's using essentially all forms of threats to the European Union. I just want to touch on two other countries which was of interest. Canada has played an outside role in this uprising, and a lot of it has to do with the Iranian Canadian community and what that community was afflicted with when an Ukrainian airline leaving Iran coming to Canada was shot down by the Iranian regime. And it had hundreds of Iranian Canadians on board, and they were all killed. So the Canadian government has been very proactive, not only in, I would say belatedly, but essentially now coming to the recognition that it has to bear more pressure, it has to be the voice of the protesters, and it has to take actual steps, such as labeling the IRGC as a terrorist organization and holding the regime responsible, not only for the deaths in those that airline that was shot down by the Iran regime, but also by what's going on today. So Canada, not a member of the JCPOA, is playing a bit of an outsized role and taking really the lead in passing policies against the regime. In the Middle East, I would say that Saudi Arabia is probably the country that both has been the biggest recipient of criticism and threats by the Iranian government. As you know, there's a natural animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And today what we're seeing is that the Iranian regime threatening the Saudis because of Saudi Arabia being deemed as a major provider of intel and news coming out of Iran, and some of the media outlets being supported by the Saudi government. So Iran has used threats, the Iranian regime has used threats against the Saudis to have them limit the amount of information that's coming out and pushed out to the rest of the world. So that Saudi Arabia is kind of getting some of that heat. At the same time, in the Middle East, we're seeing that Arabic and Dari-speaking mercenaries right now being brought into Iran to police the streets. And Marjan can also, and Goli can speak to this, but this is a very important turn of events, both pointing to the fact that the Pasdaran and other regime police forces are not being effective in putting down these uprisings, oftentimes not willing to shoot to kill, and therefore the need for outside mercenaries. And we know that they're there because they're Arabic speaking, they're Dari speaking, and there was a video coming today from the airport in Tehran showing mass numbers of Afghani soldiers being brought in order to help quell the uprising. So that's the other Middle East angle that we need to keep an eye on. Just a final point about Australia. I mean, among the Western countries, Australia has been more muted and quiet on this issue. And it's a question mark as to why and what is the reason that the Australian government has been more quiet and not ready to criticize the Iranian regime, and especially if it's really a violent reaction to the protests. So with that, I really want to go to Goli. We haven't heard from her yet. Goli, if you could please talk about the significance and the risk rewards of these global governments supporting the people of Iran. How important is it, and where do you think are the risks and the rewards of the global community coming out in support of these protests?
Thank you very much, Sharon. And I also want to thank the World Affairs Council of LA very much, and also World Oregon, which is actually my home state's World Affairs Council that I participated in for a very long time. And it's really a pleasure to be on this panel with the both of you. I think before I answer that question, I'd like to back up just a little bit and add a couple more points to what both you and Marjan mentioned. You know, I think one of the things that I feel like I constantly need to explain to a lot of friends and the people around me and people in Washington is why Iran is very different than its neighboring countries. I think that's really important to put out there. Like, for example, when we're talking about the Iran's women's movement, this is not a movement that just happened during these protests. You know, Iranian women, there are more Iranian college educated graduates in Iran than there are men. You know, the Iranian women's liberation movement started in Iran at the same time that it started in the West. In the 60s, many of us were back in Iran. Our mothers were part of that movement. They raised us, and people like us are now raising their daughters and their granddaughters in Iran. And the Iranian women's movement did not stop because an Islamic Republic came to power. It has been alive and well. I think it's really important to highlight that. The second thing I wanted to highlight is that Iran in general is a very highly educated country with a 98% literacy rate, which is incomparable to some of the neighboring countries around Iran. And up to 40% of people have some level of higher education in Iran. It is really critical to understand those points. And then, of course, the demographics of Iran is 30% of them are under the age of 30, 65% of them are under the age of age of 30, with the majority being under 25. So essentially, you have a very young, youthful, savvy, connected population that is seeing what's happening around the world, and they want to have a part of it. The second thing I wanted to mention, in addition to what Marjan said about on the 2009 protests and uprising in Iran, in addition to, unfortunately, the Obama administration being quiet and silent about these protests, is that what happened in Iran at that time, the Iranian population was leery of what had happened in Iraq and all the internal strife that was going on in Iraq. And the regime took full advantage of that, with propaganda going on that if we go, we are the force of stability here. And if we go, you will encounter the exact same issues that Iraq is encountering today. So there was a real fear and trepidation on the part of the Iranian population. In fact, one of the IRGC leaders just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, had a tweet that said to Iranian women that you want to take off your hijabs now, but if we go, you will have the same fate as the Yazidi woman had in Iraq. So I think we really need to understand that. But now we're in 2022. We're not in 2009 anymore. Iraq and Syria are older stories, and I think people are definitely feeling empowered to go out there and do these protests. I'm happy to go into some of the geostrategic implications that you asked me about, but I also think it's nice for us to have a dialogue. So I don't know if you want me to go into that. We want to add something to that so that.
Well, it's up to you. I think, Marjan, if we go back to you and talk about, what this regime, how it's showing up and trying to respond to these uprisings, do you think it has the capacity in any way to respond to its own citizens? Can it survive, and can it give some sort of solutions or some sort of response that might possibly quiet these uprisings? Do you see it as foreseeable, Marjan?
No, there is a cartoon that is being circulated on social media, and it's a caricature of protesters coming to have a conversation with a government official, but the government official is just responding back with a weapon. And this cartoon was created because, in response to the protests and to the massive unrest that is spreading across the country, rather than listening to what was going on and addressing the realities of what the masses are expressing, they said, you don't need to take to the streets. You can just come and talk to us. We will have a civil discourse about your needs. But as they have realized that there's no such thing as the civil discourse, that the Iranian regime has not ever proven itself capable of civil discourse. Even before the protest, whenever there was a meeting where members of the society wanted to ask for justice, ask for the whereabouts of their loved ones, for the reason to have more financial prosperity and resources, schools with roofs where the children could actually go to school, or they wanted to have access to just simple basic rights and resources. Either they were humiliated, they were ignored, they were called enemies or instigators, and their regime has never really proven itself capable of any level of reconciliation with its own people. There was an incident just a few days ago in Sistan and Baluchistan where a young man was advocating for his community. And as he was speaking, they actually turned off his mic. This is in the middle of this unrest and in the middle of really a critical point for the regime itself. You would think that they would try to at least change some of their attitudes and behaviors, but no, there is no such thing. And time and again, this regime has proven to itself and to its society that they have no other way to respond, no other way to address the needs but just to suppress those who are calling for difference and for a better situation. I'm going to kind of address a question that has been brought up here. And
Marjan, I just wanted to give Goli, before we go to the question, I want to give Goli a chance to talk about what the US government can do today. As a former Assistant Secretary of State yourself, Goli, you know the halls of Washington very well. Talk to us a little bit about, given the reality on the ground, given that we think this regime is not able to kind of fix the problem it's in, what can we look to our US government to, and what possibly can the US, European Union, other governments be doing today to be very helpful?
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question, Sharon. You see, from my perspective, one of the most significant issues that I've seen with US foreign policy on Iran is that it's been incredibly partisan. And oftentimes it's been for the consumption of the domestic audience rather than doing actually something significant that bears fruit in Iran. Like, for example, you have Republicans on the right that have been promoting regime change in Iran without really having much of an understanding of the US inspired 1953 coup in Iran that literally led to the 1979 revolution and the impact that it had on the Iranians' view of the United States. Then on the left, you have the Democrats that have been trying to make friends. As you highlighted, one of the most important tenets of this regime is this anti-Americanism. And the Democrats have been, to the left, have been very focused on trying to make friends with a regime that anti-Americanism is one of its most critical pillars. So there is a happy medium here where if both parties literally work together and put the polarization aside, maybe we could come to some kind of a conclusion. One of the things that I'm seeing with the Biden administration is that at the very least, JCPOA is on hold, because when you really think about the JCPOA in general, and some of my colleagues in Washington have told me that people were kind of following the JCPOA course because the idea was that it was, in a way, it was better than nothing. But I think for many of us who have an understanding of the clerical mullah mindset in Iran, it's very difficult to negotiate with a mindset like that, where gaining a nuclear weapon is the number one tool in their toolbox for their survival. Because otherwise, there's all sorts of reasons why these people need to go, as we're seeing right now. But if you have access to the nuclear weapon, you, in a sense, become like the Kim dynasty in North Korea, where you become untouchable. So, and that's why what's happening today is in fact a gift. And in terms of talking more about what the US can do, I think it's great, some of these statements of support that we're seeing. The G7 had a number of very, very important statements of support that came out. But from my perspective, and I'm sure from your perspective, it's time for that next step to be taken. Because to be perfectly honest with you, having represented the US at the UN General Assembly and having represented the US at the UN Commission on Human Rights, unfortunately, and I take really no joy in saying this, I am not holding my breath as to what the UN can do, because the UN gets things done by votes, and the majority of, Iran has a lot of sway at the UN. Hopefully it will decrease as time goes on, but that's the facts right now. So maybe I'll leave the two of you to opine on that, and then maybe we can come back later to what more the US can do.
Well, I wanted to go back to Marjan and talk about next steps. The regime seems to be, the pillars are very much shaky and hopefully crumbling, those pillars that we mentioned. The people recognize that they're at a point of no return. There is really no reforming this regime. And we have the international community essentially coming to the realization that the nuclear deals will not be a fix to this current problem, especially with the complexity of Russia now. Russia is a party to JCPOA, and right now the Ukraine-Russia issue kind of creates a whole new layer of complexity. So what can we imagine? I mean, we have only a few more minutes before we go to questions, and I know, Marjan, you want to answer one of the questions you saw already in the chat, but before we go there, let's envision a little bit. Imagine what would a post-Islamic regime Iran, what could it look like? What could it be there? I know that the diaspora Iranian community is really trying to get their arms around this question now. Who are the real credible leaders in the diaspora who could be helping? Who are the people in Iran? There's a lot of talk about leaderless revolution. What does that mean? Will you talk a little bit about that, please, Marjan?
There's so much packed in this question. Let me just say something that, you know, like you said, for a long time, there was hesitancy about looking into a third way in dealing with Iran. We thought that our only options with Iran are either war or a JCPOA. And we did not think that there would be a third way. We boxed ourselves into this paradigm. And I actually have an article in National Interest about this, you know, addressing this very issue. But we made a mistake in thinking that dictators can behave like diplomats. Dictators will never behave like diplomats, because they will change the rules as they go, and they will just follow their own self-interest and self-survival. They do not care about their own civilians, and they do not care about international laws, and that's why they are this way with the UN and other international agreements. So, and the people of Iran have realized also that they can only rely on themselves, because the international community has failed them time and again. And they don't really care what happened in 1953. They really don't care about this. They care about right now. As far as most people inside Iran are concerned, 1953 was paid off when they took the 79 hostages. I'm sorry, in 1979, they took the American hostages. So most people in Iran believe that that is a wash at this point. So the third option is to support the Iranian people achieve self-determination, and to support the possibility of Iranians to have safety in the transitional days after the overthrow of the regime, not to instigate outsiders who have a reputation for being instigators, either separatists from the borders on the left and the right, or the MEK movement that tries to sow division inside the country as well, and has a reputation for being a military entity that has Iranian blood on their hands. So it is really important to keep those detractors out of Iran during the transitional days, and allow the Iranian people to facilitate in safety their own electoral process. And we have never had as many leaders in Iran as we have them right now. But they're so smart, and they have evolved and in their level of sophistication and self-governance to withhold the names of their leaders, because as soon as a name is released, what happens? Those people are arrested, and they are jailed, or they are attacked on social media through the cyber police and cyber army of the Iranian government. So there are leaders working right now on various aspects of the transition and future governance, and it is our responsibility to honor them and to give them the power of self-determination as much as possible.
Well, that's absolutely right. And I think really having this balance of what the people of Iran want versus how governments around the world and the diaspora Iranian American community can do to support the people of Iran. I think there's real clarity that this has to be something that the people of Iran determine for themselves, what a post-Islamic regime Iran might look like. Goli, do you have any comments on that you want to add? And then we'll go back to Rachel and take some questions from the audience.
Right. Yeah, and I think very good points by both Marjan and yourself, which I don't really need to elaborate on. I think the one thing that I'd like to say before we get to Q&A is that, you know, the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, essentially controls 80% of Iran's economy, and they have their hands in all the major trades and industries. So there's a lot of money that's coming to them. And task number one for Western governments, United States, and especially EU, who literally has the majority of the trade with these Iranian companies, is to try to determine how do you choke off the funds. Because the people that, Sharon, you were mentioning at the beginning about all these proxy fighters that they're hiring, that the money that they're paying them is coming from somewhere. So choking off the funds of IRGC really is task number one. And the other thing that I really would love to propose is that the United States, along with its democratic allies, maybe G7 plus a number of other countries, there really needs to be an international conference on Iran, and only on Iran, to talk about and to think about what the next steps are about Iran, in addition to supporting the people of Iran, supporting the protests, but taking these important steps, choking off the money to IRGC, freezing the assets of all the Iranian leadership that is currently either in the United States or Europe, potentially revoking the residency permits of their progeny who are here or in Europe. There are a number of these steps that can be taken that will put direct pressure on the IRGC, which was set up for exactly a day like today. The IRGC was set up to fight for this revolution. And so for them to go, it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, it's going to take energy, and I think they really need to be focus number one.
Goli, I totally concur, and it's really about the survival of this regime at any cost, at whatever cost, right? All right, Rachel, I see we have a number of questions in the queue for the Q&A chat, so I want to make sure we have enough time to address that, so I'll pass it over to you, Rachel.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here for this incredibly important conversation. So our first question is, after decades of conflict between the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian people, many have suggested that a two-state solution is the answer. Do you think a multi-state solution is viable in the case of Iran?
I'm sorry, Rachel, a multi-state solution or a two-state solution?
Yes, multi-state is what the audience member asked.
All right, well, I'm not sure what exactly is meant by multi-state solution. This is a little bit, there is impact on the Israeli-Palestinian relationship by what Iran does today, this regime does, and what it will be in the future, right? There's no doubt. The fact that, as I mentioned, the regime essentially poses an existential state threat to the state of Israel. There's no question about that. And so what Israel is able to do, how safe it feels, and how it's able to negotiate with its Palestinian partners will be impacted by what the current regime of Iran looks like and what a possible future regime can be. There's no question that the Israelis have been, going around the world and talking about the threat of this regime. And they've been the ones who also really wary of JCPOA. The Israelis know better than any government that the regime of Iran cannot be trusted. And its word and its promises and its deals are meant to be broken and are definitely unreliable and not credible. So I think the dynamic is a very important one. Israel's keeping a very close eye on what's happening in the regime and trying to stay quiet in some ways, because they know that the regime uses this narrative that what's happening on the streets of Iran is a Zionist plot. It is the Americans doing it. So I think Israel has to keep a, kind of a fine line, but at the same time allow the people of Iran to make their own determination, and with the very clear acknowledgement that the ripple effect of what happens in this regime will impact the whole Middle East and especially Israel. I'll stop there. I don't know if Marjan and Goli want to answer that in any other way.
Yeah, maybe we should move on to other questions as well.
Right.
Sure. So our next question is actually in the same vein. This audience member asked, is the Jewish population in Iran in further jeopardy because of the uprisings?
Marjan, why don't you take that, because that's an area you cover very closely.
I think right now there is a unifying level of threat and frustration in the country. As I said before, I think that whereas other groups may have had different struggles in the past, at this moment, I think the country is united in the shared level of sufferings that they're experiencing. And although the Jewish community lays very low and does not really publicly participate in such activities, we can say that, probably everyone is vulnerable today. All of the segments of the society. The most vulnerable are the ones who are taken to the streets every day.
The young women, right? They're the ones who are really out there in front.
Yep.
Thank you. So another question that we received, this audience member said, you've talked quite a lot about what governments can do to help the protesters in Iran. And we are well aware that in America, staying silent in the face of injustice can lead to the same thing happening in our country. What are some concrete and effective things we can do in the US on an individual level to support and stop these horrors from happening to the citizens of Iran?
Actually, I love that question, and thank you for the person who asked this question. The way I look at this sometimes is kind of like a flow chart. Sorry to use a business term here. It's like, when the average person actually talks about this, posts about this, shares this information, discusses it with friends, there's a movement that gets started. And then the media start paying attention, because one of the issues that we're seeing today with regards to the Iran protests is because the media are not allowed in Iran. First of all, the Iranian government does not give visas. And then what they've done in the past is the handful of journalists that were there, they jailed 2 of them. One of them, the Washington Post reporter, Sharon Nazarian, and then they kicked out the New York Times reporter. So essentially the reporting that's done in Iran is without having anybody there. So when the media sees a lot of activity on social media, they get more energized and more engaged to cover it. And when the media covers it more, then you have global decision makers paying much more attention. I mean, one of the things that I can raise is that, for example, Amnesty International has a petition out there that just closed with regards to the UN Commission on Human Rights and the UN status of women actually taking a stance on Iran, and 1 million people signed that. Once again, I hope I'm wrong. I'm not sure if the UN will pay attention to that, but regardless, the fact that 1 million people signed a petition like that is of value.
I will add to that. I think that what Goli said is incredibly important. I think the biggest fear right now for activists inside and outside is that this story will be buried with the next crisis that will come up. So I think that and that is inevitable. Other crises will happen, but I will hope that all of you who will speak out about injustices that are taking place in the different parts of the world, including the US, particularly when it comes to the struggling and the suffering of women, you'd be honest, and you would also include women of Iran and the injustices that are taking place every day in Iran, in your actions and in your words, and you do not discriminate or differentiate between Iranians and other humans, because they don't. And they are relying on you to keep their stories going and to be the voices of their silenced voices.
So I think we have time for one more question. So this audience member asked, there is a remarkable power imbalance in Iran. Realistically, is there a path to make structural changes to the country, given that any pressures by the US or G7 will be countered by other global players?
I mean, I think those pillars that I laid out at the beginning are important, and the longevity of this regime has as much to do with political credibility and legitimacy as much as economic. So Goli's point to the role of the international community to really chokehold this regime from access to funds that hold it up literally is incredibly important. I just feel that the institutions that are the bill hold this regime on their pillars are shaken, And what comes next is a big question. And I can tell you that Goli, Marjan, and I, and many in the diaspora community are talking about that. What will those institutions need to be for a future Iran that hopefully could be a democratic government, that could be a representative government? And we know from our own democracy how difficult that task is. And so the institutional changes that are needed, some of the seeds are there, and Goli referred to them. The fact that the Iranian people are highly educated, the fact that they're highly informed, the fact that they've been going to the electoral ballots and they've been voting at local elections and presidential elections. They weren't always valid elections. They were not, always credible elections, but there is that history and experience of going to the ballot box and selecting leaders. So I think some of those important variables are there. Whether this regime will be toppled and the people of Iran will get an opportunity to create real institutions that could really lead to a real democracy is the question that we're all grappling with. I don't know, Marjan and Goli, if you want to add that.
Rachel, I'd love to add something to that. I think from one perspective, when we look at the timing of these protests, it's difficult. Russia is at war with Ukraine, there's inflation, there's economic woes, there's all these other issues that global governments have to deal with. But I think there's actually another way of looking at this, and it's that these protests, the timing of these protests is actually a gift to Western powers. First and foremost, because Russia has its hands full with its incompetence in the Ukraine. And when Russia has its hands full, when Iran is concerned, that is a big gift. And in fact, if we look at China and China's position on what is happening in Ukraine, they have been relatively quiet on this topic. And that's exactly where we want China to be. So in many ways, if there was a time for Western democratic, not just Western, but just democratic powers in general, we're going to support Iran and its protests, this would be the time, because the good that can come out of it in essentially removing a regional power that has done nothing but create mayhem regionally, and is now developing drones and missiles and long-range missiles and all the other bad actor things that it does. This is a time where the world needs to be paying attention.
Well, thank you all so much. I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Nazarian, to close us out for the day.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to thank my colleagues Marjan and Goli, and really the LA World Affairs Council and all the audience who's with us today. Thank you for your pointing questions. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for keeping this issue on the front pages and front lines, both for our own governments and for the people of Iran. Please know that they are listening. The people of Iran are energized by what they are seeing, the kind of support around the world, in the capitals around the world. And so we appreciate the opportunities to bring more facts to you and make sure that we are all there together, hand in hand with the people of Iran, to bring about this change that is so long overdue and needed. So I want to thank Goli and Marjan again, and the LA World Affairs Council.
You all were so superb. This was such an important discussion and so moving. And I think if with your busy schedules, I would love to have you all come back maybe in a few months and give us an update on where we are with some of these key milestones. And I just thank you all for everything that you're doing on this important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Kim.
Thank you very much, Kim. All the best, everyone. Have a great day.